I mean, from a strictly biological perspective, most people in the trans community would agree that you can't change sex. It's physiologically impossible. And it's not like, and we try to disprove them on this point of, well, hey, look, every single cell of the human body that has a nucleus is sexed. And so to change the sex of your body, you'd literally have to swap out every single cell. I mean, your bone structure is male or female. Scientists have found more than 6,500 sex-specific genes. So like your esophagus is male or female, your arteries are male or female. All of this would have to get changed if you wanted to change a person's sex. Now, some animals can change their sex. It's a really fascinating phenomenon. Some fish, for example, there's one called the Japanese goby fish, and it's typically a habitat of females with one male alpha in there, alpha male. But the interesting thing is if you pull the alpha male out of the habitat, the largest female within a week will physically transition into a male fish and be capable of reproducing as a male with the females. If you reintroduce the original alpha male back into the habitat, the largest female who had became male will transition back into female and begin being again able to reproduce as a female with the male. So this is called sequential hermaphroditism. It's present in less than 1% of the whole animal kingdom, but it does exist. Human beings, it does not exist. We're a sexually dimorphic species. And so your sex is determined by how an organism is organized for reproduction. So there's only two mature reproductive cells. It's the sperm or the egg, that's it. The gonads, it's the testes, it's the ovaries, that's it. There's no third, there's no fourth, there's no spectrum. You could have disorders of sexual development where one or both are not functioning properly, but sex in the human being is a dimorphic thing. That's one or the other. Now, upon hearing that, a person who experiences gender dysphoria might say, look, I'm not arguing with any of your science. All I'm trying to do is look the way I feel. I'm just saying that my internal sense of my sexual identity is that I don't align, my identity with my body. That my body, I know is that, but I don't feel like that's who I am. And so all I'm trying to do is mitigate this dysphoria and live an authentic life and try to be who I truly feel that I am at my core. And so that's how they would respond to that. And I think we need to listen, okay, well, when did you start feeling these things? When did this come along in your life? And kind of hear their story. Because the narrative that the culture will give them is that if you don't feel at home in your own body, well, there's a diagnosis for that. The diagnosis is you are trans. That's your identity, it's nothing else. And so the solution, if you are trans, is to transition. And so if they're a young child, typically it begins with social transitioning. That's the first phase. That would be changing perhaps your name, your clothes, your restrooms, those types of things. That is social external transition. The next stage would be puberty blockers. So these are drugs given to kids as young as 8 years old to block the natural progression of puberty. Now, when you're supposed to be hitting puberty at a certain time, and if you don't hit it, and puberty doesn't happen, it's actually a disease. It's called Kallmann syndrome. And so medicine can then be given to induce puberty because it should be happening at this time. So essentially what they're doing with puberty blocking drugs is inducing a diseased state in the kids. And they say, wait, puberty blockers have been used before, and it has been for what's called precocious puberty. That's when a child hits puberty far earlier than they should, so they kind of hold it off until the right window of time, and then they let puberty take its course. That's the way historically it had been used, but only for a very limited amount of time. But what happened is there was, over in the Netherlands, there was what they called a man who described himself as an adventurous endocrinologist, met a gender dysphoric young woman and decided, well, why don't we just block puberty and then put you onto cross-sex hormones afterwards? And by blocking your puberty, we're gonna give you more time to decide if this, gender journey is right for you. But it's really not putting a pause button just on puberty. You're pausing their neurological development, you're pausing their bone development. We've got like 15-year-old boys now that have osteoporosis like an 80-year-old woman, and there should be a healthy teenage boy. And so it's halting the bone development where it's becoming brittle, the teeth, the bones are becoming brittle. And so there's major long-term outcome problems with that. But then when they put the kid on puberty blockers, typically, more than 95% of the time, they'll go on to get cross-sex hormones. And so it should almost be viewed as a single pathway of treatment instead of one then the other, because of when you start a kid down this path, imagine a boy on puberty blockers for 4 years. And now he's 15, and his buddies have broader shoulders, deeper voices, a 5 o'clock shadow. He still looks like a prepubescent, like 10, 11-year-old boy. Is he going to feel more aligned with his masculine identity? No, less. And so they almost inevitably go on immediately after to cross-sex hormones. But if you go from one to the next, you're sterilized for the rest of your life. So we're sterilizing these 15, 16-year-old kids and just telling them they're now going to be at home in their own body. And then they transition over to these cross-sex hormones. Now, these things do not create the primary sex characteristics of the other sex. So you don't develop the genitals, the reproductive capacities. You develop more of the secondary sex characteristics. So when you put the girls on T or testosterone, it'll have a masculinizing effect on her physiology. So she'll have a deeper voice, gradually grow some facial hair, change that, as I mentioned, that pitch of her voice that might go back to normal or might stay deep for the rest of her life, even if she goes off those drugs. But also what will happen, her risk of heart disease will quadruple. She'll have to have her uterus removed within 5 years because of the increased risk of endometrial cancer. And if they want to keep up this masculinized look in the woman or the feminized look in the man, this is a lifelong medicalization. Because as soon as you off the drugs, within a couple weeks, your body wants to go back to the way it naturally should be. And so you are a pharmaceutical patient for life. And so there are severe physiological outcomes to these drugs that we're experimenting with these young people with. And then the next stage would be surgery. And that wouldn't be just one surgery necessarily. There's anywhere from tracheal shavings to get rid of the Adam's apple, a reconstruction of the forehead to look more feminine. One of the most common is called top surgery. That's a reconstructed surgery of the chest. And so this is very popular among the young girls. In fact, if you look at GoFundMe.com, there's more than 40,000 girls right now on GoFundMe.com raising money to have their breasts removed because they don't identify as female. What's interesting is very few of them want the bottom surgery. It's not necessarily that many of them want to be male in their identification. They just know they don't want to be a woman. And that ties into some deeper issues of, like, Abigail Shrier wrote a book. She said, girls are fleeing womanhood like a house on fire without any particular destination in mind other than to get out. And so for many of them, it's a disguising of their sexual maturation as a protective mechanism against abuse and being viewed as some sexual object. So there's so many layers of complexity for why a person might want to go to such extremes to hurt their body to feel safe or to feel more themselves. But then when you follow them down the road after these procedures, they're promised the dysphoria will go away, you'll feel at home in your own body. The suicide rate actually climbs to 19 times higher than the general population. And people say, oh, it's because all you transphobic bigots. Well, it's actually because 90% of people who take their life have a diagnosable mental health condition. And surgeries and hormones are not the answer to those things. What's needed is a deeper dive into where is this stuff coming from? And is this really the answer to transitioning? Lastly, before I pitch it back to you, I'm reading a book right now of the collapse of the biggest gender clinic in the United Kingdom, which just happened a couple months ago. And this journalist wrote this 400-page expose of this. Now, 35 of the psychologists quit from that clinic because they say, we are not even being allowed to explore the deeper mental health issues. That more than 40% of people identify as trans actually meet the criterion for an autism diagnosis. There's a lot of other stuff going on. And so one of the psychiatrists there had an idea. He had been meeting with post-operative transition patients that were wrestling with gender dysphoria and meeting with patients who wanted a transition surgery. And so he thought, well, what if we bring these two patient populations together and they could just get to know each other, share their stories. And he said an amazing thing happened when he brought those two groups together. Out of the 100 patients who wanted to transition, after meeting those who did, only 2 of them went through with their own transition. 98% of them realized this is not the answer.